In the Gilded Age, times were changing. It was a time of immigration, monopoly, and industrialization. The Gilded Age was a time where everyone had to fight for themselves to get ahead and build fortunes. However, not everybody made millions. It was the poorest people that did the hardest work, the factory workers. Getting up before sunrise, workers across the country prepare for another day of work. Often supporting a family, these men and women are struggling to put food on the table and provide for their kids. As the sun starts to rise, millions of workers begin to trudge towards the factories where they'll spend their day. Dirty, tired, and vastly underpaid, these workers are the force that drives American industrialization. Churning out textiles, metal components, mass-produced consumer goods, and billowing clouds of smoke, these factories are working around the clock. However, a few are manufacturing a product that would change the world: the Model T. The sun lightly peeks his head above the clouds as thousands of Ford workers flock to the factory. Making just dollars a day, these men and women were the workforce of the American era known as the Gilded Age. A time of industrialization and wealth for some, while many fell below the lines of poverty. The factory held the greatest revolution in transportation since the railroad and the car. Ford's assembly line produced the Model T, the world's first ever gas-powered car for the American people. Workers were stationed on the first of its kind assembly line to increase the efficiency of the manufacturing process. So efficient, in fact, that a brand new Model T car was pushed out of the factory every 24 seconds.
All this led to a great profit for Ford himself and boosted the company into the head of motor transportation industry for years after. While Ford's massive fortune exponentially grew, so did his workers. Ford's wages back in 1900 were revolutionary to the blue-collar worker. Workers in the Michigan plant earned $5 per 8-hour workday, almost twice the industry average of $2.24 per 9-hour day. These wages, however, still did not meet the adequate pay that the workers deserved for their grueling work. Life inside the factory was no easy task. Assembly line workers were expected to be precise and fast to keep up with the highly demanding speed of production that Ford envisioned. This demand leads to unsafe conditions for the workers as well as overworking of employees, making the job strenuous and difficult to manage for weeks at a time.
Ford himself was no stranger to the mechanical blue-collar work that occurred in his factories, as he experienced it himself when he was younger. Born in 1863 on a prosperous farm in Dearborn, Michigan, to parents William and Mary Ford, he spent much of his early childhood and teenage years around machines and mechanical workings. Ford's first job was an apprentice to a mechanic, where he learned the important principles that would lead to his technological advancement. Inspired by what he knew and what he could create, Ford left his rather good job at the company Edison Illuminating to work on his dreams. Before Ford could even create his first motor-powered car, he created the first ever gas-powered horseless carriage behind his garage.
This would then lead to his creation of the Ford Motor Company in 1900, producing the Model T and revolutionizing the transportation industry forever. The Model T car would not only add mass amounts of money to the economy due to the Revolutionary War of travel, but also directly back and forth in Ford's personal bank account. Adjusted for inflation in 1920, Ford's personal net worth was over $1.7 billion, making Ford one of the richest men in not only just America, but the world. Ford's vast wealth and quick rise to financial fame was no uncommon place for the Gilded Age. This great wealth that Ford had created not only granted him financial power, but also granted him with the power only so few held during the Gilded Age. This power is no better explained than by Henry George in 1879.
Material progress cannot rid us of our dependence on land. It can but add to the power of producing wealth from land, and hence, when land is monopolized, it might go on to infinity without increasing wages or improving the condition of those who have but their labor. It can but add to the values of land and the power which its possession gives. Everywhere, in all times, among all peoples, the possession of land is the base of aristocracy, the foundation of great fortunes, the source of power.
Henry Ford was no stranger to the power that land provided. Ford's company owned vast tracts of forests, mines, and other land. Ford used this land to build the sawmills, body part factories, chemical plants, iron foundries, and assembly lines that would be the foundation of his empire. One plant was the Behemoth River Rogue plant, which stretched 2,000 acres across the Rogue River. At one point, it was the largest industrial complex in the world. The Rogue plant received iron ore, coal, and limestone on lake barges, and the iron went directly to the foundry, where it would be used to make engine blocks, cylinder heads, crankshafts, and other automobile supplies. Eventually, the Rogue supplied almost all of the Model T parts.
A revolution of its own, the Model T changed the face of transportation. However, cars were just one form of transportation that aided the massive increase in innovation. Trains became a great means of transportation, especially helping to expand the country westwards. In 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act was passed, which led the government to give loans to railroads and 1.5 million acres in land grants. Later, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed.
The Transcontinental Railroad was first of its kind and able to transport hundreds from New York to San Francisco in just a week's time. The 1,776 miles of train tracks were laid by a combination of freed slaves, Civil War veterans, and Chinese migrants. However, the railroad did not come without a cost. It was estimated to cost $60 million in 1862. Today, a value over $1.2 billion. That cost would soon be worth it to the American economy, as by the year 1880 had an estimated $50 million in products would be transported per year on the railroad. The railroad sparked national confidence and big business gains.
The creation of railroads partnered with other innovations that attracted more and more farmers into the western fields furthered western expansion. Often attractive as a fresh start and a blank slate, the West saw swarms of migrants in the 19th century. However, while railroads did have massive benefits, they also had a negative impact. Railroads caused corruption, ecological disaster, and furthered already present business competition. As they stretched across the western plains, railroads became a major cause of disappearance of bison. Often, passengers would shoot bison out of the train windows when they were driving past. Indian plains, reliant on bison as game, suffered as a result.
However, they were disregarded in the face of huge economic opportunities. J.P. Morgan took hold of these opportunities and contributed to the negative effects as well. Born on April 17, 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut, Morgan followed his father's footsteps to the banking business when he was 19. He then struck out on his own and established the banking group J.P. Morgan and Company in 1871. Later, Morgan began investing in railroads and ended up owning around 1/6 of U.S. rail lines. In 1895, Morgan loaned $60 million to the federal government to avoid an economic crisis, and he helped avoid economic panic again in 1907. However, Morgan was investigated later in his career for his part in the Northern Securities Corporation and allegedly being part of a small trust that controlled the U.S. banking and industry. After FDR's investigation, the Supreme Court used the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up the Northern Securities Corporation, which controlled 3 of the major Midwest railroads.
Before there were big business tycoons like Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan, the first robber baron was being built. Born into a poverty-stricken family in New York in 1836, Jay Gould lived with his mother and father. He lived on a failing farm and his father worked at a failing shop. In that shop, however, Gould learned the skills that would make him millions. While his father worked as a shopkeeper, Jay taught himself how to survey land. This sparked his intellectual imagination and began serving as a career creating maps of New York for pay. Later, to keep his dream alive, Gould would invest in $5,000 into a business in northern Pennsylvania. To pay for his needs, Gould became a leather merchant in 1860 and moved to New York City, where he would find himself at Wall Street. Quickly picking up on the trade, Gould would become a successful speculator. He would try and predict what stocks would go up or down for a profit.
He was a natural businessman and began his reign of terror on the stock market just months later. Gould would buy and sell his stocks of his own companies while bribing the judges and legislators who overlooked corruption in Wall Street. Gould spent his newfound fortune and invested back into the railroad industry. With a seat on the board of directors of the Erie Railroad, a failing company, but with Gould's dream of moving as far west as Chicago, the company could be saved. Gould could only do this by buying out the railroad from his nemesis Cornelius Vanderbilt. To do this, Gould would illegally acquire 100,000 shares of Erie Railroad to become the owner of the company. After his acquisition of shares, Gould went back to New York City to bribe legislators to make his move legal, so they did. Vanderbilt scorned as he finally met his businessman tycoon match and settled for $1 million and left possession of the railroad to Gould. And so the first ever robber baron was born.
However, some people disagreed with monopolies and trusts. As House of Representatives member James B. Weaver said, "It is clear that trusts are contrary to public policy and hence in conflict with common law. They are monopolies organized to destroy competition and restrain trade. The main weapons of the trust are threats, intimidation, bribery, fraud, wreck, and pillage. Take this one well-authenticated instance in the history of the Oatmeal Trust as an example. In 1887, this trust decided that part of their mills should stand idle. They were accordingly closed. This resulted in the discharge of a large number of laborers who had to suffer in consequence. The mills, which continued in operation, would produce 7 million barrels of meal during the year. Shortly after shutting down, the trust advanced the price of meal $1 per barrel, and the public was forced to stand the assessment. The mills were more profitable when idle than when in operation."
Across the nation and the world, the popular board game Monopoly sits in cabinet shelves and under coffee tables and is known as a popular game for all ages. The Monopoly game was created by Liz Mackey during the Gilded Age. The game famously represented how easily resources and companies could be acquired by one person to create a monopoly. Monopolies thrived during the Gilded Age, like Andrew Carnegie and his steel company that controlled both the American economy and steel manufacturing business. That business controlled the entire steel industry in the United States, buying out any competitors and using all natural resources. The business was bought by J.P. Morgan at an estimated value of $15 billion in today's money. Likewise, John Rockefeller's oil company, started in Cleveland, Ohio, controlled all of the oil and gas industry for years, making him the most wealthy man in America for decades. Unlike any other time in American history, the trains and automobiles allowed for one person to both sell and control mass amount of natural resources and markets.
Well, rich businessmen like Gould, Ford, and Morgan prospered, the gap between the rich and poor grew larger and larger. In a factory-driven world, cheap labor swelled the urbanizing cities along with corruption and crime. With the new massive influx of immigrants and struggling farmers, they became the perfect employees for low-wage and dangerous jobs. While the rich became richer, the poor became poorer and larger. Aggressive capitalism from the robber barons like Gould and Morgan was praised, and it created massive competitions between the companies. These competitions, as well as overproduction of goods, would lead to a decrease in profit and more bankruptcy, which only furthered this gap. Henry George, who was one of the most influential American economic treatises of the 19th century, addressed this growth of poverty and wrote a book called Progress and Poverty in 1879. Henry George believed that tax on land would hurt those who leave land idle, and therefore would encourage investment and stop or decrease poverty and unemployment.
George was convinced that all of the society's problems were rooted in increasing land values, which stopped the poor from getting property, reduced farmers to tenancy, and frowned upon investment. He claimed that society was responsible for increasing in land values and that it was unfair for only landlords to be able to gain from the increase in land value. George's belief about this economic gap were only one part and contributor to the intellectual movements that began to take shape in the Gilded Age.
Debates over wealthy inequality, politics, and multiple public reform efforts came to light in the Gilded Age. Some of the biggest business debates during the Gilded Age was whether or not success and wealth was being achieved through exploitation, and if this wealth should be used however they wanted or to support the public through taxes. This relates back to the robber barons such as Ford and Gould. Most people thought different things about wealth and how it was required and how it should be used. Some justify this gain of wealth as being inevitable or fate. This belief is called social Darwinism. These massive debates, combined with terrible working conditions, would only lead to the resistance from the working class and bring up more reforms.
This working class began to grow because of the rapid increase in immigration, which led to urbanization and a new urban culture. As cities and factories grew larger and more important, people began to recognize this and immigrate to America. Soon the population greatly increased and immigrants became perfect workers for factories. They were willing to do low pay and dangerous jobs which were needed in factories. With this increase in population brought an increase in diversity, which led to prompting ideas of equality, especially for women. This diversity brought more and more new cultures into urban areas.
Across the country, blue-collar workers and artisans grew rapidly more angry about the harsh conditions of labor that were created by monopolies and large companies. Workers in steel mills worked for hours on end for meaningless pay of less than $3 per day. As workers grew more and more angry, more and more called for reform, and when their calls were not heard, they created their own solutions. The first union organization was created by a foreign man named Samuel Gompers. Gompers' family moved from London, England in 1863 to the Big Apple. At the age of 10, Gompers started a cigar-making business with his father and would go on to make it his profession as well. As he grew up, he realized that the artisans of America were severely underpaid for their work and wanted a solution.
So he joined with 15 local cigar makers and created his own workers' union. He was promoted soon to a larger union of cigar makers and NYC as president. After seeing the massive success the union gave the workers, he and other skilled workers met in 1886 to create the American Federation of Labor, the first of its kind. The AFL unionized skilled workers and artisans for fair pay. By only including skilled workers, Gompers knew that he could obtain both political and economic control. Gompers used these powers in the forms of strikes, but never used it for political power. In the 20,000 strikes that occurred due to the AFL, over 10,000 reached a conclusion in the favor of the worker. In a time so violently struck with corruption and overuse of workforce, the American Federation of Labor defended America's working class. In 1893, Samuel described his goal. The organized working men and women, the producers of the wealth of the world, declared that men, women, and children with human brains and hearts should have a better consideration than the inanimate and dormant things usually known under the euphorious title of property. We demand a reduction of the hours of labor, which would give a due share work and wages to the reserve army of labor and eliminate many of the worst abuses of the industrial system now filling our poor houses and jails. Labor insists upon the exercise of the right to organize for self and mutual protection. The lives and limbs of the wage workers shall be regarded as scarce as though of all others of our fellow human beings. That an injury or destruction of either by reason of negligence or maliciousness of other shall not leave him with redress simply because he is a wage worker, and by no means the least demand of the trade unions for adequate wages.
In the period of growing inequality and poverty, men alone were often unable to support their families. The Gilded Age saw an increase of women in the workforce, with working-class women taking away any available positions to make money. This included factory jobs, domestic work, and more. However, upper-class and upper-middle-class women were also making changes during this time period, especially with regards to suffrage. Several associations, such as the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Party, were dedicated to reforms and female suffrage. As one such reformer, Jane Addams, was part of the NAWSA and the fight for equality. She was an outspoken pacifist, founding the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She also founded the Hull House in 1889, a settlement house that worked to provide education for immigrants. As time went on, these settlement houses would become part of a larger political system that worked by providing services and opportunities to the urban poor immigrants.
Often fleeing famine and lack of social mobility, many immigrants came from Asia, Europe, and the South. They were willing to work for very little money and often took low-paying wage work. Austin Hadlin says,
"Although the immigrants often clung to the illusion of independence as a token of hope, the reality was inescapably different. For the employer who set the race manipulated them to his own interest, while the employee had no choice but to accept. The new effect was to shift from the employer to the employee the whole burden of labor insecurity. These elements of insecurity, the immigrant learned, were not confined to the conditions of the working dead. They pervaded the total relationship of the worker to the economy. The fluid labor supply that gave the employer complete liberty to hire as many workers as he wished, when he wished, also gave them the ability, at will, to dismiss those whose toil he no longer needed."
as they came to America, they settled in communities and created cultural enclaves like Chinatown or Little Italy. These settlements expanded cities and increased their cultural diversity. Often, city inhabitants had the opportunity to socialize with people of many different ethnicities and races. However, not everybody welcomed these immigrants. With growth of immigrant communities came conflict over nativism and Americanization.
Hostile to foreign culture, supporters of Americanization wanted assimilation into American culture and politics. Seeking wealth, many Chinese immigrants came to America during this period. An immigrant himself, Li Chu, said, "I heard about the foreign American devils, that they were false, having made a treaty by which it was agreed that they could freely come to China, and the Chinese as freely go in their country. The man had gone away from our village, a poor boy. Now he returned with unlimited wealth, which he had obtained in the country of the American wizards. After many amazing adventures, he became a merchant in a city called Mott Street. The wealth of this man filled my mind with the idea that I, too, would like to go off to the country of wizards and gain some of their wealth."
However, Chinese immigrants often experience prejudice with the proliferation of anti-Chinese sentiment and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. With pressure to both remain true to their heritage and also accept the American environment, immigrants were often forced to compromise between two cultures. As the rich grew more rich, the poor grew more poor. The gap between robber barons like Ford and Morgan increased the depth of the American wealth inequality. Large CEOs ranked in billions of dollars off the back of the American blue-collar workforce, while the workers themselves fell deeper into poverty. These men were gods during the Gilded Age, truly untouchable by any government or union. As their wealth grew more and more, theories developed from the great success of these men. Many inspired to become these great giants of wealth and followed along in the creation of a laissez-faire government. The theory was that these men created themselves, and the money and power they held should not and could not be taxed or supervised by the government. This idea led to a national rise in racism.
Ford, Morgan, and Rockefeller were all white men, and their counterparts living below the poverty line were all immigrants and people of color. To the rich, they had no duty to help those below the poverty line because they started from nothing just like them and did not deserve a boost. While other business moguls denied help and donations to the poor, other millionaires started to use their wealth for good. Andrew Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth in 1889 for this exact issue in America. He saw the great wealth that he had and also the great gap between him and those living in poor, poverty-stricken neighborhoods. His solution was not to simply give the poor his money, but to donate to institutions such as schools and libraries that would help the whole community equally for generations to come. This philosophy led to the creation of parks, schools, universities, and libraries for poor, lower-income families and neighborhoods. These institutions of generosity and knowledge led to a great rise in more diverse and artistic future for our jobs. A new wave of artists, writers, singers, socialists, and politicians wanted the gospel to guide the future of America.
They called out the injustices in the capitalist system that had created the divide between the rich and the poor and wanted a complete upheaval of the American economy. Socialists wanted more government lead help, and communists wanted equality, a government income for all. In their view, this would level the playing field for all. However, not everyone during this time period was either poverty-stricken or filthy rich. A new class began to rise during this time, a class of professionals, doctors, lawyers, high-level corporate employees. This was the middle class. With access to education and goods, these people enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle and income. Enjoying more leisure, the middle class was part of the drive towards consumer culture. Economic differences did not end there, however, but expanded into the divide between Republicans and Democrats. At the end of the Civil War, Republicans heavily favored American business and industry and proposed a protective tariff on imported goods, while Democrats disagreed and were in favor of no tariff against goods to create a free-flow market. During the age, a third smaller party named the Populists, or the People's Party, arose to protect the interests of farmers. Farmers' production and harvest drastically changed during the Gilded Age due to the increase in transportation options opened up by the government-funded railroads. Instability in markets caused farmers to create new local groups of farmer organizations that helped many farms through tough times. The new technology in the period also allowed for farmers to increase production and survival rates of their crops that created a mini boom in agricultural output. While the division between Democrat and Republican ideals drastically divided the country, voter turnout in elections reached an all-time high, furthering debates over policy and economy. Explained by Heather Cox Richardson.
Men like Leland Stanford unabashedly poured money into politicians' pockets in order, as he put it, to keep the noisy and demagogic element from injuring railroad interests. In early 1884, the New York Times charged that 16 senators owe their election entirely to the indirect use of money and the exercise of corporate power and influence. Harper's Weekly condemned the rapidly increasing part which money plays in our elections and our government.
By 1888, the U.S. Treasury ran an annual surplus of almost $120 million. The tariffs that protected businesses were so high that they bought in significantly more than the government used. To those nervous about the influence of business and government, this seemed proof that tariffs were not being used for anything but to enable robber barons to control the economy. After the collapse of the Confederate Army and the eventual defeat of the Southern troops in Virginia in 1865, the Southern Democratic Party had set to start again. After the North had won the Democratic Party, which mostly consisted of Southern states, they had to restart political agenda, but this time with Republicans holding their hand. Democratic and Republican ideas during this time then had a stronger similarity than years before. Democrats and Republicans mostly related to the laissez-faire economics and were pro-business. During this time, a new party gained public eye. The emergence of the Populist Party allowed the thought of a break from the two-party systems. For years, the Democrats and Republicans controlled the nation's government with little to no break in their opposition. While it was not the first third party to form out of the Democratic and Republican parties, the Populist Party was the first to gain electoral votes. This new party, however, wanted more than a break from the two-party system. They called for a one-term president, the adoption of referendums and initiatives to allow citizens to directly shape legislation, and creating a government-funded public infrastructure like railroads and telegraphs. They also wanted to see more progressive labor reform with the adoption of an 8-hour workday limit. Robert McMath described the populist movement as, "The populist dilemma stemmed from a basic fact of politics. The object of parties and candidates is to win at least 50% of the vote. By the time of the Populist Crusade, there was a diminished opportunity for minor parties to influence national policy by gaining a foothold in Congress. Congress by the 1990s had come close to institutionalizing the two-party system by granting enormous powers to the presiding officers and chairmen of the various committees. Even in the South and the West, populism had only been able to garner no more than 25 to 45% of the vote. There seemed to be only two options, both with serious drawbacks: either fuse with one of the major parties or go it alone. This new party would be the first sign of light for a progressive tomorrow for the Americans of both men and women. Although the party saw a quick and massive upcoming in the world of politics in America, after 1900, the heyday of the populist movement was over. After becoming the first third party to field votes in an American election, they declined in popularity. They still sent a candidate for the 1904 and 1804 presidential elections, but saw very little of the same turnout as before. The first ever somewhat successful third party in American history was over.
After America escaped the Civil War, social and economic troubles still remained. These reminiscences of a broken economy led to the monopolization of resources, resulting in the quick rise to fortune of some while others dove deeper into poverty. Revolutionary innovations in the transportation industry, in the Transcontinental Railroad and the Model T opened up the floodgates to wealth in the West and spread across national companies. The opening of the railroad allowed for a quick rise in robber barons like Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan to conquer the American capitalistic economy and rise to political power. To feed these giants of industry, urban areas rapidly grew due to an increase in immigrant workers, leading to an urbanization and development of large cities like New York City, while also creating a new urban culture.
As the rich grew richer and the poor grew poorer, many called for changes in America's economic system. These debates and conflicts over industrialization, the economy, monopoly, immigration, and equality would be debates that would lead the country into the 20th century and the modern era. In the Gilded Age, fortunes were won and lost every day, the poor were trampled underfoot, and the rich were sacrosanct. The Gilded Age was the pivot on which America swung from a developing country into an industrial power, and the issues created still influence the country today.